Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Napoleonic Wars, 1803–1815. Now buckle up as we begin. The fragile peace of Amiens crumbled in May 1803 when Britain declared war on France, igniting 12 years of continental warfare that would reshape Europe forever. Napoleon Bonaparte, now first consul of France, had used the brief peace to consolidate power and prepare for renewed conflict. The British refused to evacuate Malta as agreed, while Napoleon's expansion into Italy and Switzerland violated the treaty's spirit. Across the English Channel, both nations prepared for inevitable war. Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée at Boulogne, dreaming of invasion, while Admiral Nelson's Royal Navy resumed its blockade of French ports. The stage was set for the most transformative military conflict in European history, one that would crown Napoleon emperor and ultimately lead to his downfall. By 1804, Napoleon had proclaimed himself Emperor of the French, crowning himself at Notre Dame Cathedral in a ceremony that shocked European monarchies. The Third Coalition formed in 1805, uniting Britain, Austria, Russia, and eventually Prussia against French expansion. Napoleon's invasion plans for Britain were abandoned when Admiral Villeneuve's combined French and Spanish fleets failed to achieve naval supremacy. Instead, the emperor made his most brilliant strategic decision, wheeling the Grande Armée eastward from Boulogne toward Austria with lightning speed. The Austrian general Mack, commanding 70,000 troops at Ulm, found himself completely outmaneuvered by Napoleon's rapid advance through Germany. Within weeks, the French had crossed the Rhine, swept through Bavaria, and positioned themselves behind Austrian lines. This campaign would demonstrate Napoleon's genius for maneuver warfare and set the stage for his greatest victory. The speed and precision of French movements left European generals stunned and struggling to comprehend this new form of warfare that combined rapid marching, concentrated attacks, and superior logistics. The Ulm campaign of October 1805 showcased Napoleon's tactical brilliance as he encircled General Mack's Austrian army in a masterpiece of strategic deception. While Austrian forces waited for French attacks from the west, Napoleon had secretly marched his corps through the Black Forest, cutting their communications with Vienna. The Grande Armée's 7 corps moved like the fingers of a massive hand, converging on Ulm from multiple directions while maintaining mutual support. Austrian attempts to break out were systematically crushed by superior French coordination and artillery. General Mack, realizing his hopeless position, surrendered with 30,000 men on October 20th, 1805. This bloodless victory eliminated Austria's main field army before Russian reinforcements could arrive, clearing Napoleon's path to Vienna. The Ulm maneuver would be studied in military academies for generations as an example of perfect strategic execution. French losses were minimal, while an entire enemy army simply ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The campaign demonstrated how superior planning, speed, and coordination could achieve decisive results without major battles. December 2, 1805, the anniversary of Napoleon's coronation, witnessed the Battle of Austerlitz, perhaps the greatest tactical victory in military history. The emperor faced a combined Austrian-Russian army of 85,000 men under Tsar Alexander I and Emperor Francis II. While commanding only 68,000 French troops, Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, abandoning the strategic Pratzen Heights to lure his enemies into a trap. As Allied forces descended from the heights to attack his supposedly vulnerable right wing, Napoleon launched a devastating counterattack through their weakened center. Marshal Soult's IV Corps stormed the Pratzen Heights in a perfectly timed assault, splitting the Allied army in two. The Austrian and Russian left wing, pursuing French forces toward frozen ponds, found themselves cut off and surrounded. Artillery fire cracked the ice, drowning hundreds of enemy soldiers in the freezing water. By afternoon, the Allied army was shattered, losing 27,000 casualties compared to only 9,000 French losses. Austria sued for peace immediately, while Russia withdrew beyond its borders. The Battle of Three Emperors established Napoleon as Europe's dominant military force. Prussia's entry into the war in 1806 proved disastrously premature, as Frederick the Great's once mighty military machine had stagnated while Napoleon revolutionized warfare. The Prussian army still employed tactics from the 7 Years' War, with rigid linear formations and predictable maneuvers that French mobility could easily exploit. Napoleon's lightning campaign began in October 1806, with the Grande Armée advancing through Thuringia in 3 parallel columns that confused Prussian intelligence about French intentions. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt on October 14th destroyed Prussian military power in a single day. At Jena, Napoleon himself led 96,000 men against Prince Hohenlohe's 38,000 Prussians, while 20 miles away at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout's single corps defeated the main Prussian army under the Duke of Brunswick. The psychological impact was devastating. Prussia's military reputation, built over decades, collapsed in hours. King Frederick William III fled toward Russia, while French cavalry pursued broken Prussian columns across northern Germany. Fortress after fortress surrendered without siege, and within 3 weeks Napoleon occupied Berlin itself, parading down Unter den Linden in triumph. The brutal Battle of Eylau on February 8, 1807, marked Napoleon's first taste of serious adversity, as 67,000 French troops clashed with 76,000 Russians under General Bennigsen in the bitter East Prussian winter. Unlike previous campaigns, this battle offered no brilliant maneuvers or decisive victories, only grinding attrition in a blinding snowstorm. Russian forces proved far more resilient than Austrians or Prussians, fighting with desperate courage despite horrific casualties. Napoleon's center nearly collapsed when a massive Russian assault broke through French lines, forcing the emperor to personally rally his troops. Only Marshal Murat's spectacular cavalry charge with 80 squadrons saved the French army from potential disaster, temporarily driving back Russian infantry. The carnage was unprecedented. Over 25,000 total casualties left the snow-covered battlefield carpeted with frozen corpses. Neither army could claim victory, though Russians withdrew during the night, leaving Napoleon master of the field. This Pyrrhic triumph demonstrated that Russia would not be easily conquered like other European powers. The Grande Armée required months to recover from Eylau's losses, while Napoleon learned that his eastern enemies possessed different fighting qualities than western opponents. The Battle of Friedland on June 14, 1807, restored Napoleon's reputation with a crushing victory that finally brought Russia to terms. General Bennigsen foolishly positioned his 60,000-man army with the Aller River at their backs, creating a tactical trap from which retreat would be nearly impossible. Napoleon, commanding 80,000 troops, recognized this opportunity immediately and concentrated his forces for a decisive assault. The French attack began at 5 p.m. with a devastating artillery barrage that shattered Russian formations packed against the riverbank. Marshal Ney's corps stormed the town of Friedland, while Marshal Mortier's infantry rolled up the Russian left flank, driving thousands of enemy soldiers into the river. Russian casualties exceeded 25,000 men, including many who drowned attempting to cross the Aller under French artillery fire. This complete victory forced Tsar Alexander I to negotiate, leading to the Treaty of Tilsit, where the two emperors met on a raft in the Niemen River. Napoleon had achieved his greatest strategic goal, neutralizing Russia while dominating continental Europe. The Fourth Coalition collapsed, leaving only Britain to continue resistance from behind the protection of the Royal Navy. France now controlled territory from Spain to Poland. Spain's uprising in 1808 opened a festering wound in Napoleon's empire that would drain French resources for 6 years. The Peninsular War began when Spanish patriots rejected Joseph Bonaparte's imposed rule, launching a brutal guerrilla conflict that introduced a new word to military vocabulary. Spanish irregulars, supported by British expeditionary forces under Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, transformed Iberia into Napoleon's ulcer. The shocking French surrender at Belaine in July 1808 marked the Grande Armée's first major defeat shattering the myth of French invincibility across Europe. Napoleon personally intervened with 200,000 veterans, quickly recapturing Madrid and defeating regular Spanish armies in conventional battles. However, the guerrilla war proved impossible to suppress, as Spanish partisans ambushed French convoys, assassinated collaborators, and disappeared into mountainous terrain where organized armies could not follow. French atrocities only intensified Spanish resistance, creating a cycle of violence that corrupted military discipline. Meanwhile, Wellington's British forces established a secure base in Portugal, gradually building the Anglo-Portuguese army that would eventually drive the French from Iberia. The Peninsular War diverted enormous French resources from other theaters while teaching Europe that Napoleon could be defeated. Austria's attempted revenge in 1809 during the War of the Fifth Coalition initially caught Napoleon distracted by Spanish commitments, leading to early Austrian successes in Germany and Italy. Archduke Charles, Austria's most capable general, had reformed the Austrian army along French lines and struck before Napoleon could concentrate overwhelming force. The emperor rushed from Spain with the Imperial Guard, but his hasty counteroffensive at Spur-Essling in May 1809 resulted in his first clear tactical defeat. Austrian forces successfully repulsed French attempts to cross the Danube, inflicting 23,000 casualties, including the death of Marshal Lannes, one of Napoleon's closest friends. This defeat shocked Europe and encouraged further resistance to French dominance. However, Napoleon learned from this setback and spent 6 weeks methodically preparing for a second Danube crossing. The Battle of Wagram in July 1809 vindicated French military superiority through careful planning and concentrated artillery fire. Despite losing 34,000 men, Napoleon's army of 188,000 overwhelmed Archduke Charles's 136,000 Austrians, forcing Austria to accept the harsh Treaty of Schönbrunn. The campaign cost France dearly, demonstrating that even victories now required enormous sacrifices as European armies improved their tactics and fighting effectiveness. Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810 represented the pinnacle of his dynastic ambitions, but also marked the beginning of his strategic overreach. Divorcing Josephine to secure an heir, the emperor sought legitimacy through alliance with Europe's oldest ruling house. The birth of the King of Rome in 1811 seemed to guarantee the Bonaparte dynasty's future, yet this domestic triumph coincided with growing international tensions. The continental system, designed to strangle British trade, increasingly strained relations with Russia as Tsar Alexander I allowed neutral ships to bypass the embargo. French annexation of German territories and the creation of satellite kingdoms violated the spirit of Tilsit, while Russian nobles suffered economically from restricted British commerce. Napoleon's Polish policies also threatened Russian security, as the Grand Duchy of Warsaw appeared to preview a restored Polish kingdom that would block Russian expansion westward. Diplomatic negotiations throughout 1811 failed to resolve these fundamental conflicts, as both emperors prepared for inevitable war. The Grande Armée assembled along the Niemen River grew to 600,000 men drawn from across Europe, the largest military force ever assembled for a single campaign. Russia mobilized its vast human resources while adopting a defensive strategy that would draw French forces deep into the homeland's interior. The Russian invasion began on June 24, 1812, when the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Lithuania, launching the campaign that would ultimately destroy Napoleon's empire. The multinational force of 600,000 men included French, German, Italian, Polish, and other contingents, representing Napoleon's dominance over continental Europe. Russian strategy, masterminded by General Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, relied on trading space for time while avoiding decisive battle until French supply lines became impossibly extended. The Grande Armée found itself advancing through devastated countryside where Russian forces had destroyed crops, livestock, and shelter, implementing a scorched earth policy that denied sustenance to invading troops. Heat, disease, and desertion decimated French ranks long before any major battles occurred, as horses died from exhaustion and men collapsed from typhus and dysentery. The Battle of Smolensk in August provided only a Pyrrhic victory, as Russian forces escaped encirclement while leaving behind a burning city that offered no supplies or winter shelter. Napoleon faced a crucial decision: continue deeper into Russia or consolidate gains and winter in Smolensk. His fatal choice to press forward toward Moscow reflected the emperor's inability to accept anything less than complete victory, even when strategic wisdom counseled restraint. The Battle of Borodino on September 7, 1812, became the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, as 130,000 French troops clashed with 120,000 Russians in a savage contest for the road to Moscow. General Kutuzov chose to make his stand on carefully prepared defensive positions anchored by the Rivsky Redoubt and Bagration's fletches, gambling that Russian resolve could break French morale. The battle began at dawn with Napoleon's artillery bombardment, followed by infantry assaults against entrenched Russian positions that refused to yield despite horrific casualties. Prince Bagration's death while defending his fortifications epitomized Russian determination to sacrifice everything for the homeland's defense. French forces eventually captured the main Russian positions through sheer persistence, but Kutuzov's army withdrew in good order rather than disintegrating like previous European opponents. The Pyrrhic French victory cost 30,000 casualties, while Russian losses exceeded 45,000, but the strategic result favored the defenders. Moscow lay open to French occupation, yet the Russian army remained intact and capable of continued resistance. Napoleon had won his battle, but lost the campaign, as occupying Moscow with a depleted army would prove strategically meaningless without forcing Russian capitulation through decisive military victory. Napoleon's entry into Moscow on September 14, 1812, marked the hollow culmination of his greatest military effort, as the ancient Russian capital stood eerily empty of inhabitants and officials who might negotiate peace. Governor Rostopchin had evacuated the population and prepared the city for destruction rather than collaboration, leaving Napoleon master of abandoned palaces and deserted streets. The Great Fire that began that very night consumed 3/4 of Moscow, destroying supplies and shelter the Grande Armée desperately needed for winter survival. Whether started by Russian patriots, French soldiers, or criminal elements, the conflagration eliminated any possibility of comfortable winter quarters, while the Grande Armée melted away through disease and desertion. Napoleon's expectation that Tsar Alexander would sue for peace after losing his ancient capital proved completely mistaken, as Russian resistance only intensified with patriotic fury. The emperor waited 5 weeks in the Kremlin for negotiations that never came, while his army dwindled from 100,000 to barely 80,000 effective troops. October's end brought the first winter snows and the terrifying realization that retreat across hundreds of miles of hostile territory was now inevitable. The French position had become strategically hopeless, surrounded by Russian armies in a devastated wasteland with no possibility of reinforcement or resupply until spring. The retreat from Moscow beginning October 19, 1812, became one of history's greatest military disasters, as Napoleon's Grande Armée disintegrated during its 1,000-mile withdrawal to Poland. Early November snows caught French forces still wearing summer uniforms, lacking adequate food supplies or winter equipment necessary for survival in the Russian climate. The Battle of Mali-Yaroslavets blocked the southern route through fertile territory, forcing the army to retreat along the devastated Smolensk road, where no supplies remained. Russian forces under Kutuzov, reinforced by Cossack cavalry, harassed the retreating columns continuously while avoiding major battles that might revive French fighting spirit. Discipline collapsed as men abandoned their weapons and equipment to struggle individually for survival, while horses died by thousands, forcing the abandonment of artillery and wagons. The crossing of the Berezina River in November became an epic of military endurance, as French engineers constructed bridges under fire while Napoleon's army fought desperately to escape Russian encirclement. Of the 100,000 men who left Moscow, fewer than 30,000 crossed the Berezina in fighting condition, and only 20,000 would eventually reach safety in Poland. The emperor abandoned his army in December to return to Paris and raise fresh forces, leaving the survivors to complete their agonizing journey under Marshal Murat's increasingly ineffective command. The War of the Sixth Coalition erupted in 1813 as Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Britain united to destroy Napoleon's weakened empire after the Russian catastrophe. The emperor's remarkable ability to raise new armies was demonstrated when he assembled 200,000 fresh troops from French conscripts and German allies. Though these inexperienced soldiers lacked the quality of his veteran forces lost in Russia. The German campaign of 1813 witnessed several French tactical victories at Lutzen and Bautzen, proving Napoleon retained his battlefield genius despite commanding raw recruits against seasoned Allied veterans. However, these Pyrrhic successes could not compensate for France's deteriorating strategic position as more German states abandoned their French alliance. Austria's entry into the coalition in August 1813 proved decisive, as Metternich's diplomacy created an overwhelming numerical advantage that even Napoleon's tactical brilliance could not overcome. The three-day Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, known as the Battle of the Nations, became the largest engagement of the Napoleonic Wars, with over 500,000 total combatants. French forces fought courageously, but were gradually overwhelmed by coordinated attacks from three Allied armies, forcing Napoleon to retreat across the Rhine into France itself. The German campaign's failure cost Napoleon his entire satellite empire east of the Rhine, reducing France to its revolutionary boundaries for the first time since 1794. The campaign of France in 1814 showcased Napoleon's tactical genius in its purest form as the emperor, commanding only 70,000 men, conducted a brilliant defensive campaign against 350,000 Allied invaders. Using interior lines and rapid marching, Napoleon struck isolated Allied columns at Champaubat, Montmirail, and Vorchamps, achieving local victories that briefly revived French hopes. The emperor's last great victory at Montereau demonstrated that his military skills remained undiminished, as coordinated infantry and artillery attacks shattered an Austrian corps attempting to hold the Seine crossing. However, these tactical successes could not alter France's hopeless strategic situation, as Allied forces simply absorbed their losses and continued advancing on Paris from multiple directions. French resistance in the capital collapsed on March 31, 1814, when Marshal Marmont's corps retreated rather than fight a destructive battle in the city streets. Napoleon's marshals, led by Ney, finally refused to continue a war that could only end in national catastrophe, forcing the emperor to abdicate at Fontainebleau on April 6th. The Treaty of Fontainebleau granted Napoleon sovereignty over the island of Elba, while restoring the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVI, seemingly ending the revolutionary era that had transformed Europe. Yet this first abdication would prove temporary, as the emperor retained enough ambition and popular support for one final gamble. Napoleon's escape from Elba on February 26, 1815, initiated the legendary 100 Days that would culminate at Waterloo and permanently end his imperial ambitions. The emperor landed at Cannes with only 1,000 men, but found France receptive to his return, as Louis XVII's restoration had proved unpopular with veterans, peasants, and bourgeoisie alike. Napoleon's march to Paris became a triumph as entire army units, including Marshal Ney, who had promised to bring the emperor back in an iron cage, rallied to his cause instead. The Congress of Vienna immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and reformed the Seventh Coalition, mobilizing 700,000 troops to crush this final challenge to European stability. Recognizing that his enemies would never allow peaceful coexistence, Napoleon chose to strike first before Allied armies could concentrate, leading the reconstituted Grande Armée of 124,000 men into Belgium in June 1815. His strategic plan called for defeating Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army and Blucher's Prussians separately before they could unite, potentially forcing Britain and Prussia to negotiate, while Austrian and Russian forces remained distant. The campaign began brilliantly, with French forces crossing the frontier and driving wedges between the Allied armies, but tactical delays at Quatre Bras and Ligny prevented the decisive victories Napoleon required. The Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, would decide Napoleon's fate and reshape European history, as 72,000 French troops faced Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army of 68,000 men on the muddy fields south of Brussels. Napoleon's battle plan called for breaking Wellington's center with concentrated artillery fire followed by infantry assault, but morning rain delayed operations and softened the ground, reducing the effectiveness of French cavalry and artillery. The Emperor's tactical execution proved uncharacteristically flawed, as piecemeal attacks failed to achieve the concentration of force that had brought victory in previous campaigns. Wellington's defensive position along the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge, anchored by the fortified farm of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, proved remarkably resilient despite hours of French bombardment and assault. The crisis came in the afternoon when Marshal Ney launched premature cavalry charges against unbroken British squares, sacrificing thousands of horsemen without decisive result. Napoleon's commitment of the Imperial Guard in the late afternoon represented his final gamble, but these veteran elite troops were repulsed by British infantry for the first time in their legendary history. Blucher's Prussian army arrived on the French right flank just as Wellington launched his general counterattack, transforming tactical defeat into complete disaster as the Grande Armée dissolved in panic-stricken flight. Napoleon's final abdication on June 22, 1815, marked the definitive end of his political career as the Emperor accepted responsibility for France's military catastrophe at Waterloo. The Chamber of Deputies refused to support continued resistance, while Marshal Davout's remaining army proved insufficient to defend Paris against the advancing Allied forces. Napoleon briefly considered fleeing to America, but instead surrendered to Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon, appealing to British protection as Themistocles at the hearth of the British people. This romantic gesture proved futile as the Allied powers, led by Britain, decided that exile to the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena would prevent any future escape attempts. The Treaty of Paris imposed harsh terms on France, reducing the nation to its 1790 borders while requiring massive indemnity payments and military occupation. Louis XVI returned to his throne under Allied protection, though the restored Bourbon monarchy would struggle with the revolutionary legacy Napoleon had embodied. The Emperor's journey to St. Helena aboard HMS Northumberland in October 1815 began 6 years of exile that would end only with his death in 1821. However, the Napoleonic legend continued growing during these final years as the fallen emperor crafted the myth that would eventually restore his nephew to the French throne and inspire revolutionaries across Europe throughout the 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars concluded with Europe forever transformed by 12 years of unprecedented conflict that had redefined warfare, politics, and national identity across the continent. Napoleon's military innovations core system combined arms tactics, rapid maneuver, and concentrated artillery, revolutionized strategic thinking, and influenced military doctrine for generations. The social and political changes were equally profound, as the wars spread revolutionary ideals of nationalism, legal equality, and meritocracy throughout European territories that had known only feudal hierarchy. The Congress of Vienna attempted to restore the old order, but the forces Napoleon had unleashed proved impossible to contain completely, inspiring liberal and nationalist movements throughout the 19th century. France emerged exhausted but unified, having survived invasion and occupation while retaining most revolutionary gains, including the Napoleonic Code that would be adopted worldwide. The human cost was staggering: over 3 million military casualties and countless civilian deaths from warfare, disease, and economic disruption that affected every corner of Europe. Yet these wars also demonstrated human resilience and the power of organized societies to mobilize unprecedented resources for national survival. Napoleon's legend grew during his St. Helena exile, transforming the defeated emperor into a romantic symbol of genius and ambition that would inspire future generations. If you like today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.